Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ashleigh Mackenzie-White and I'm Adult Engagement Manager for National Museum Scotland. And my role is to help bring people like you closer to people like my brilliant colleague, Ashleigh Whiffin. I'm delighted to welcome you to this special afternoon celebrating Insect Week. Woo! Woo! Now, please join me in putting your hands together for our host, Curator of Entomology, National Museum Scotland, Ashleigh Whiffin.
You're all too kind. Thank you very much. Happy Insect Week, everybody. I hope that you are not just doing this for Insect Week. I hope if this is your first Insect Week event, it might inspire you to go and do some more. And when we talk about Insect Week is of course organised by the Royal Entomological Society. It's an annual event, so if you haven't got that stuck in this year, don't worry, there's next year. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us all to celebrate the wonderful little things that run the world, which is of course insects. So we're here today to champion insects, but also to do a wonderful collaborative discussion that's going to cross different disciplines of history, art and science and delve into the wonderful topic of women in entomology. So I've got some fantastic colleagues with me today, but first we're going to kick off and I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about who I am and what we have in the collection here at the museum. So I am an entomologist, but I will stress that today I'm wearing my moth hat. I am naturally a beetle person, a coleopterist, but we're talking about moths today mostly, and I did want to stress that I am also a fan of moths. I love being an entomologist. I really am very passionate about insects, and my favourite part of my job here as a curator of entomology is going out into the field and actually seeing insects and witnessing their amazing behaviours and their incredible diversity. Now, our collections are pretty special. They're about 200 years in the making and contain approximately 2.5 million insect specimens. Woo! So it's a really impressive and valuable collection. Obviously, being the National Museum of Scotland, our strengths lie in our Scottish material. We do have one of the best collections of Scottish insects, but it's international in scope, so we do have material from all over the world. Now, insect collections and museums are a fantastic resource for studying our insect biodiversity. There are so many different uses of the collection, but a really important one for us at the moment is tracking changes in our biodiversity. So you can see this beetle specimen here on the left. I promise it's the only beetle that I've snuck in today. The labels beneath the specimen, that is what details all that precious data that relates to that insect and how it was collected. So it's going to be the where was it collected, when was it collected, by who, and any extra information about the habitat. And the subsequent labels are its identification and our little barcode, which helps us database that specimen. So it's our job as curators to collect, preserve, identify, and then to curate those specimens into the collection with the ultimate aim of them being accessible to any of our visitors. And when I talk about visitors, I'm talking about other entomologists and researchers, but also students and artists too. So the collections are used for tracking environmental change, as I've mentioned, and we're going to hear a lot more about this shortly. But the other uses of the collection are for education and outreach. So, of course, being the museum, we develop public displays and exhibitions, and we host events just like today. It's also really important for young early career entomologists and the local naturalist community to be able to use the collection as a resource, as a reference. So if you're trying to work out what insects you have, what you've collected, there's no better place to come than the collection. Also, we welcome a lot of artists to the collection too, so we open our doors to artists to come and use the collection as reference to observe those tiny details that are sometimes difficult to capture when you've got a live insect moving around in front of you outdoors. So lots of different uses of the collection. Now, of course, the collection has grown over the years and we've been fortunate to receive the collections of many prominent entomologists. We're going to hear a lot about one of them in particular today, but I just wanted to emphasise this lovely lady here. This is Doherty Jean Jackson, and she is one of my entomological heroes. She's best known for her work on water beetles, but actually her entomological journey started with moths as well. So we have some of her moth specimens in the collection. We have thousands of her specimens in the collection, and some of them are pinned like these, some of them are slide mounted, but we also have her archive as well, which contains her illustrations. And Doherty was a really impressive scientist. Her publishing record actually spans 7 decades, and she published on everything from fairy wasps to great diving beetles. It was really impressive, and she had 2 publications in Nature. So, one of my heroes. The collection at the museum hasn't had too many female staff working with it. Most prominent is probably Isabel Baldwin, who stayed with the collection for 30 years, and she was a specialist in spiders, and she really curated the spider collection very, very meticulously. It's really to incredible high standards. Since then, we've had my colleague Lyndall Pereira work with us for a couple of years, and she specialised in the aquatic insects like mayflies and caddisflies. And then, of course, there's me. I've been with the museum for about 10 years now. Again, mostly focusing on beetles, but I do dabble, I do a bit of everything. We're really fortunate, though, to have had lots of wonderful women entomologists that have worked with us by being volunteers or research associates. And so we're going to be hearing from one of those ladies today, and we have another member of our team in the audience, actually, that I'm going to point out and say thank you, Doherty, because we are so grateful to all our volunteers that do some fantastic work for us and give up their spare time to support the collection. So that's far too much from me. Let's get stuck in and hear from our wonderful panel that are with us today. So I'm going to introduce them to you now properly. Firstly, we have Dr. Don Opitz, who's joined us all the way from Chicago, where he teaches at DePaul University. Don's a historian of science, where he specialises on women in science, particularly with an emphasis on studying those women in the amateur naturalist community. Then we've got Dr. Katty Baird. Not quite yet. She's so keen. We've got Dr. Katty Baird, who is a wonderful local moth recorder and moth expert. She is also now a published author. Woo! And Katty is a very passionate volunteering for both butterfly conservation and us at National Museum Scotland. Thank you for being here, Katty. And last but not least, we're joined by Holly Doherty, who has joined us from Dundee today. She's an art student and budding entomologist, and she also volunteers her time with butterfly conservation. Thanks for joining us, Holly. So without further ado, I think it's time to pass over to our first panellist, Don. Take it away, Don.
Thank you, Ashleigh. So I'm Don Opitz, and I'm an historian of science. And as an historian, I don't collect bugs, but I collect historical facts. And I use those facts to create stories about the past, including about one of my favorite women entomologists, Alice Blanche Balfour, who lived about 100 years ago. In the context of our Insect Week, I'd like to return to Alice and suggest how her pursuit of entomology represents a more general pattern by which women of her generation had done science. And this was at a time when there were sex discriminations against women that created challenges. Here's Alice Balfour. Alice began her pursuits as a young girl in the 1860s. And she did that within the context of her home environment. And she was by no means unique. There were other women, British women entomologists who also pursued their interest in entomology and forged careers that overlapped with Alice's. And I've included some pictures here of some of the other women that we might also, talk about in the context of this panel. But we're going to focus today on Alice. So to put this in context, our sponsor for Insect Week, the Royal Entomological Society, did welcome women members at its foundation in 1833. But very few women were actually members of the society. And this illustration of their initial meeting kind of depicts the reality that it was very much a men's club. Now, at the time that Alice was a member, and that was in early 1900s, what percentage of the society members do you think were women? 5%, 10%, 20, 50? So, in the year that Alice was elected a fellow, 1916, she was among 2% of the members of the society who were women. 2%. Now, that needs to be put into context. This was during a time when there were lots of ways in which women were denied access to public institutions, including institutions of higher education and the vote. So the pursuits that women scientists did had to be done primarily in spaces that were private and domestic, as opposed to those of scientific institutions. Now, to dig into that 2% statistic a little bit further, in the year that Alice was elected, she was one of 11 women of 606 total fellows of the society. Another of her women fellows was Margaret Fontaine. She was depicted on an earlier slide. And in the year that Margaret was elected a fellow in 1898, she recorded in her diaries of her feeling of what it was like to be the sole representative of her sex present, with the exception of one other lady visitor. So that gives you a little bit of an impression of the context. Now, Alice's pursuit of entomology was unique in that she focused on moths and butterflies that she found in her home district in East Lothian. In the catalog that she published, she listed out about 600 unique species that she had found and identified. And in this catalog, she also explains how she got started, and it was in the company of her brothers when they were still children. Now, of course, her specimens, she collected many more specimens than those 600 species, and I've been told that there are 10,000 Alice Balfour specimens in the research collections here at the museum. And these specimens are truly breathtaking. Now, you can see some of these on public display. There's a case just outside in the gallery here. And if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to go have a look. I want to emphasize that Alice's home and family environment was supportive of her pursuit of science. And several of her siblings also made important contributions to the sciences. And they benefited from the support and the resources that they received from their mother, Lady Blanche Balfour. This aerial view of their estate gives you the impression that the Balfours did not have to go very far to pursue natural history. They did travel. And Alice was also talented in the arts. She loved watercolor painting, and she made some remarkable series of landscape paintings during a trip that she made in southern Africa. And these were published in a folio volume, and then also on postage stamps. Her artwork and her travel writing was her way of bringing recognition and appreciation to the cultural heritage of African peoples at a time that they were dealing with the hardships of colonialism. Alice brought together her interests in art and science through entomology. And just as one example, she painted specimens of moths and butterflies in a publication that highlighted an important collection held at Oxford University. And this also kind of indicates that she was part of a broader network of entomologists. So again, she was well known within that circle during her time. But I want to conclude with a takeaway, and that is the importance of the home environment for Alice's pursuits. And I would like to suggest that that was true for other women scientists of her time. They did their work alongside the responsibilities of their obligations in the home, behind the folding shutters of their houses, to use a phrase that Alice had used when describing where she found specimens. Their homes were not only places of housekeeping, but they were places of scientific laboratories and natural history cabinets. Now, as a good historian, I list out my references, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. That was brilliant. I think coming at it from a scientist's point of view, I think we all too often, when we hear the name of a scientist or entomologist of the past, think of their scientific outputs, and we don't necessarily think about the person behind the name. So your field and your research that you do into unearthing this information about their personal lives and things is so important, because it gives us that context and, you know, allows us to feel a little bit more connected to the person behind the name. So thank you. Over to Katty now. So Katty, you're bridging that gap really between the entomologists of the past. We're going to hear about how Alice has inspired and influenced you in your collecting, your career.
Yes. Hi, so I'm Katty, and I spend quite a lot of my time, my free time, and even a little bit of my work time when I can, out and about looking for and studying and, importantly, enjoying moths. And here are just a selection of some of the species that I found around here in southeast Scotland over the last 5 years or so. And as you can see, they are a beautiful group of insects, I'm sure you'll all agree. Along with the butterflies, they make up a big group of insects known as the Lepidoptera. And the Lepidoptera are one of the most diverse groups of insect on our planet. In the UK, we have around 2,500 different species of moth. And wherever you live, you won't be far away from some moths, whether it's in the remote Scottish Glen or the middle of Glasgow city centre. There'll be moths there waiting for you to discover them. They're really important parts of our environment. Many species pollinate our plants. Some plants rely on moths for their pollination. And in particular, they're really important as food sources for all sorts of other animals. Butterflies and moths as a group are also one of the most commonly recorded group of insects. In fact, the most commonly recorded group of insects in the UK, certainly. And that means that we've got lots and lots of information. So people across the country, when they see a moth, they can send the details of that sighting to the National Moth Recording Scheme, which is a huge database managed by Butterfly Conservation. And this currently contains something like 42 million records. So that's from all over the UK, sent in by tens or thousands of recorders. And this information is really useful for scientists, for policymakers. It helps us understand where our moths occur, how our populations are changing, and importantly, what we might be able to do to help restore some of the lost populations and improve our biodiversity. And what works for moths in terms of improving habitats will also benefit all sorts of other species as well. So they're really important. It's really important that we record them and know where they live. The majority of the records in the National Moth Recording Scheme are probably just from the last 25 years or so. That's when most of the recording has taken place. But of course, people have been interested in documenting butterflies and moths for far, far longer than that, for hundreds of years. And where this information still exists, for example, in old entomological journals or on those little labels in pin specimens in museums, we can extract that information and we can add it into the National Moth Recording Scheme. And in many cases this has been done. There's still masses more to do. But this gives us an even fuller picture of how our moth populations have changed. For me in East Lothian, I'm really lucky to have a sort of first-hand look at how the moths on my doorstep have changed through the legacy of Alice Balfour. So this lady that Don has just introduced lived around 100 years ago, really close to where I now live. And like me, she spent a lot of her free time, probably as much free time as she could, documenting the moths and the butterflies that flew around the county. And she left her collection and her notebooks to the museum here, which means that I can now look at it and explore it and study it. And I've been able to go back to the places that she once went and see what I can find and compare how things are now with how they were in Alice's day. And reassuringly, there's lots of things that have stayed the same. So I go to the same places, I see lots of the same species that she once found in those places. But it's not all good news. So there's a few species now that Alice once recorded regularly, like this red carpet here. It used to be common, or fairly common in the hills. I've never seen one, and it's very likely that it's extinct in the county now. It's seen massive reductions throughout the UK. On the other end of things, there's lots of new species moving northwards as our climate warms. So actually, the number of species on offer in East Lothian to me today is much greater than it was in Alice's day. And we've got a scorched wing here, which is a beautiful moth that is increasingly common now in East Lothian in birch woodlands, but Alice never recorded it. In addition to her specimens, what's really interesting is her notebook. So they provide a whole load more information than just the moths specimens themselves. So in amongst all this information, there's information about how many moths she saw of different species. She notes down things that she didn't actually collect, so this is a fuller list of the things she was encountering than her pinned collection. She records when she didn't see something, so she goes out to look for a particular species and couldn't find it. And that's really interesting information because people so seldomly record things that they didn't find. There's also lots of really nice sort of personal comments that she makes, which helps me to connect to her really as a moth recorder. So she does a lot of grumbling about the weather and how it's no good, which we all do. It's not our mothing skills, it's the weather that's bad. And I've just picked out a couple of comments here just as illustrations for some of the things that sort of chimed with me. So the top one there, she goes on about she's got this wonderful conditions for going out sugaring. That's a way of attracting moths to a sugary bait. But the best fortnight was lost to visitors. And just when she wants to go and do her moths, she's got to entertain people at home or something like that. And that still happens. And then L. literana, it's a small green moth that she found on the trunk of a tree. She boxed it, but it escaped just as she was putting the lid on. Again, anyone who's been out moth recording with me will know that I miss quite a lot of the things I want to try and catch. So really, for me, one of the sort of most interesting things about Alice's collection has been her notebooks and the sort of opportunity that's given me to get to know her as a fellow moth recorder. And although our methods and our techniques have changed a bit, the moths we see have changed a bit, technology has certainly moved on. Computers have revolutionized how we can identify, how we can document, how we can share what we find with other people. But despite all this, the people that go out and love moths still go out and love moths. And I think looking forward to the future, with the next generation of young entomologists coming up, there's still loads of people who want to go out, look for moths and love moths. So that's a really positive thing.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Katty. Yeah, what an uplifting way to end that. Wonderful. Your passion for moths is such a source of inspiration. I'm in awe of the amount of work and time that you put into your moth recording, and I think you've inspired a huge number of people within Scotland. So massive credit to you. We are now moving into the future, and we're looking at the next generation. So that's all on you, Holly. Are you ready? So please tell us a little bit more about your journey so far.
Thank you. So I'm Holly Doherty. I'm a hobbyist entomologist and artist from the Highlands, and I'm just going to talk about a bit how I got into entomology and how maybe other people could too if you haven't done already. So I already grew up with a love of nature, kind of passed down from my parents, but it wasn't really until lockdown hit that I actually decided to take to my garden with a net and a head torch, like a lot of crazy things lockdown made us do. After I saw something online about our amazing Scottish moths, like these ones here, I just had to find out more. So I can't imagine my records from the time were very accurate, as I had quite a limited ID source, but it definitely created a curiosity about what might still be out there that I could go and explore. So I started volunteering for butterfly conservation just as lockdown passed, and that is really what got me hooked. So I met so many kind, enthusiastic people, and they were so knowledgeable. They couldn't have been happier to try and include me in everything they were doing and teach me everything they knew. So since then, I've just been volunteering as much as I possibly can and just absorbing all their knowledge. But yeah, so I feel so lucky for knowing all these people because they've led me to so many amazing opportunities, a bit like this one. That's really shaped the way that I view I view nature, and changed what I ultimately want to do with my career and life. So yeah, as I mentioned before, a bit like Alice, I'm also an artist. I really love painting entomology and just expanding. Sorry. So yeah, no, I've really found that entomology and art go hand in hand, not just in a scientific context, as of course we use illustrations for ID and recording, but most artists I've talked to actually already have an idea or a view into the entomological world. And I think it makes sense because these creatures are so colourful and they've got such imaginative forms and, you know, patterns that how could they not intrigue an artist? So a bit like these ones here, really I'm just magnifying these already beautiful creatures, which is the beauty of entomology and Lepidoptera. But yeah, no, I think definitely taking away from this, my favourite part about entomology is you can find it absolutely everywhere. You don't need to live in the countryside to see it around you. You could live in the city centre and you just have to open your eyes and find it. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Holly. That's wonderful. And you fill me with a lot of hope for the future because what you do as an artist and entomologist is really important. Like you say, the two subjects go hand in hand, and art has this capacity to deliver the science to a totally different audience. So we absolutely need your gorgeous artwork. Right, folks, I think we'll give our panellists another round of applause at this point, and thank you for their contributions. We are going to dive into the question time. So if you are using Slido, feel free to get that loaded up and put your questions in now. I'm just going to kick us off with one of my own questions, if that's okay. So, I am curious to know, what lessons do the stories of past women entomologists carry for us today? And I'm going to put that to you first, Don.
Thank you. So I love this question because there's an assumption that entomology was not for women back in the 19th century. And there were scientists like Charles Kingsley who made those assumptions. And as we saw, that's not true. So one thing that I would say is doing the historical work brings out these stories, and it's an important part of our historical narratives, and knowing that there were women of the past that not only did entomology, but did, you know, other sciences. I'm particularly fond of Alice because she's often talked about in the historical narratives as a victim of her times, stuck in the household, straddled by her needing to host visiting guests, and, you know, and other household responsibilities, but that wasn't her whole life. So to bring out her talents in art and science shows another side to Alice, which was also true of many women of her generation. So I would say that it's part of our historical record, and it gives us a very different impression about the sciences of the past than we often assume based on, you know, the common narratives that we have today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Katty, did you have anything you want to add in there?
Well, so from my sort of very personal point of view, in my explorations of Alice's collections and things, one thing that has been particularly nice is that quite often as an entomologist you go and you see a list of moths, a list of species, or you see some specimens at a museum, but to have a bit about the person behind those moths is really lovely, and that's something that I've definitely got from looking at Alice's work. So you get to know her as a person. You know, she's not just a moth collector, she's got this other life around her. And connecting up with Don here, who's done a lot of research into the history of Alice Balfour and her family, has been really lovely. So to sort of make a much fuller picture about Alice as a person. So it's not, although moths is my passion, it's the main thing that I'm interested in, it's really nice to get a much fuller picture. And I think collections like this at the museum, which have the associated notebooks and diaries and all of that, is really valuable.
And we have I should say, so many other collectors, of course, who have donated their collections, also with field diaries, notebooks. And so there's a whole load more research to be done into these collectors. I mean, I think we'd all like to know them a little bit better, wouldn't we?
I can recommend anyone who's got a little bit of time on their hand. I can recommend, there's lots of really fascinating collections, not just in butterflies and moths, but other insect specimen, insect groups. Lots of really interesting information there. And, you know, these stories deserve to be told. These people went to a lot of effort back in the day to do what they did because they enjoyed it, but to be able to bring that and to use that and to enjoy that, and it does help inform what we do as well today, I think. So
Absolutely.
Really useful.
Yeah. Thank you for that. If I may, sorry folks, I just want to jump in and I want to ask one more question before we give you the mics. Holly, you already emphasised that connection between art and science. Fully on board with this, and I'm desperate to know a little bit more about your artistic process. So how do you go about creating those beautiful sculptures and illustrations? Do you have something from life? Do you use specimens or do you use photographs?
Yeah, so I mean, I think definitely for sculpting, it's better to have like in person or a specimen, and so you can really like look at all the angles and really understand the anatomy of it. So I think that's great that the Natural History Museum has this connection with artists by lending them out and allowing them to really admire it closer, because I mean, you can't really get the detail from just a photo, so it is important to actually have these specimens in front of us.
Absolutely. And Katty, coming at it from the kind of scientific side, how do you connect with illustrations and entomology?
Well, so I really like art as a subject, and there's some beautiful entomological illustrations out there. But for me, I'm fairly rubbish at drawing. But actually, if you've got a moth or any insect, anything small that you don't know what is, it's actually really helpful to attempt to draw it, because it makes you look at the fine details, which are often really important in identifying them. Or if you can't draw at all, then again, a photograph. So taking pictures, and our cameras now are really good at getting up really close. And it's amazing how often I can be puzzling over one of these tiny little moths for ages, and then I take a picture and I look at the picture and I'm like, oh wow, it's got this big white blob here. And so just the sort of artistic process, I imagine, I'm not an artist, of making you look in detail about things. You see other things that perhaps other people don't see, and you can bring that out. So I think it's really important, and it's important to reach a wider audience, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, folks, sorry, we've hogged some time there, but okay, we'll try to make sure we get through as many questions as possible.
I'll just start with one from on here while I get round to you. What's the difference between a butterfly and a moth? How do you estimate the population of these small creatures?
Oh, great question. I'm going to hand that to you, Katty.
I think there's people in the audience who can answer this better than me. So first up, difference between a butterfly and a moth. Not a lot, really. So as I said, that butterflies and moths together form this big group of insects known as Lepidoptera, and that name means scaly wings. So they're all defined by having 4 wings, which are covered in these tiny little scales. So that's all butterflies and all moths. And then within the Lepidoptera, we can split them up into different, what we call families or superfamilies, based on similarities between them, similarities in genetics and morphology. And so we have hawk moths, and we have clearwing moths, and we have burnet moths, and we have owlet moths, and we have butterflies, and we have a whole host of 42 different groups. So butterflies are really just one of the small groups of Lepidoptera, and all the others are moths. So we have 2,500 species of moth in the UK, I think I said, and it's about 60 of butterflies. So if you want diversity, you have to move away from butterflies and do moths as well.
I like to think of butterflies as kind of the gateway group, because they're very beautiful, and people that like butterflies, if you've managed to see your 60-odd species, then you need to find something else to get your teeth stuck into, and moths are the next natural progression.
I suppose I should add, really, so if you're in the UK, it's a lot simpler. Butterflies are day-flying. There are day-flying moths as well, but you are very less likely to find night-flying butterflies in the UK. And if you look at the antennae, most of our butterflies have little sort of swollen clubs at the end of their antennae, and most of our moths don't. So those are two kind of broad features. There was another part to that question, which was about how do you estimate. Well, you need some clever statisticians, really. But we've got all sorts of data coming in to the National Moth Recording Scheme from recorders all over the country. And then there's also another scheme running alongside that, which has been going since the 1960s, I think, called the Rothamsted Insect Survey. And that's been collecting moths at fixed sites every day during that time period. So that information together, counting the numbers that they get of different species, and some extraordinarily clever hocus pocus with stats, can give you some really robust sort of trend figures of how species are changing with time. But I'm probably not the best person to go in any more detail than that.
No, that was great. Thank you, Katty.
Thank you. I'm just wondering how Alice went about IDing all her species. I mean, did they have a library with lots of books, which means that everyday person wouldn't have access to that, or would they? I just wondered where she started all these Latin names and how she came to recognise what she was seeing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just going to repeat it for anybody that didn't catch that one. It was, how did Alice go about identifying her specimens? And quite rightly, yeah, the resources available back then were very different to what Katty has at her fingertips right now. So, Katty.
There you go. Yeah, so it has changed a lot. So Alice had books, and I've got some of the same books that Alice once had, and they're almost impenetrable compared to what we've got today. So it was very much identification was very much based on having the pinned specimen. So they're set with their wings out like this, which isn't how you find them in the wild usually. And looking at veins on the wings and sort of very fine morphological details, which we don't tend to use now. And she sent her specimens to other people physically in the post to get identities checked. So in her notes, there's lots of information about her boxing up specimens. And these could be several years after she caught them, so she would accumulate them. And then she'd send them down to the Natural History Museum, where there were a few experts in the field, and they would help her identify. So it's very different now. I mean, now we have, you can take a photograph on your phone, send it to somebody who'll say, that's that. Or even, you can even get apps nowadays that will tell you what it is then and there. So very different. It must have been hard for her actually to have found something she didn't know what was, but not actually get an ID for that and for 6 years or something. I would have forgotten entirely. I don't think you want to add anything to that, Don.
I just want to add that she was part of a community of local naturalists, and she inherited some of those local naturalist collections. And, there was a lot of exchange of information, and she was part of a natural history society that was, based in East Lothian, and it still exists to this day. So there was a lot of information sharing that was happening within these naturalist networks.
Yeah. And that's still true today. It's exactly, how it goes, but it's just much more rapid.
Yeah, and the books of her day are actually very good. They're still useful for me today because they go into a lot more detail about the natural history of the species and where you might find them and how you might find them. So they're still relevant today, but just harder.
That leads into a nice question from Jane. Has anyone come across women in entomology who did not come from well-off families back in the 1800s?
Great question there. Come on, Don, let us know.
So I have to confess, I'm sort of a Downton Abbey sort of historian. So my familiarity is with, those well-to-do examples, but there are other historians that have looked at sort of the laboring classes and more of the middle classes. And in another project that I do, I look at women horticulturalists who were, not of the well-to-do classes. So I think the answer is yes, but I can't tell you from my own research because it's not what I focused on.
Hey. This is from an anonymous person, but liked by someone else. When you're catching the moths and butterflies, or any insects, Is it usually catch and release, or are you keeping them and then potting them into a catalogue?
That's a great question, and it does depend on a number of variables. So, Katty, do you and Holly want to?
Yeah, do you want to go?
And I can hop in
first.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm recording, I'm just catching them and releasing them, so I'm just taking the data. But whereas things like I do pin bumblebees, so not something that I'd kill, but you just stumble upon them out in the wild, just usually hit by cars and stuff. You can just pin them, log their data, and that can be used. But yeah, I wouldn't actually go out to take specimens.
No. And on the whole, I don't either, because you can identify almost all our moths by a photograph. I sometimes take a specimen and have it in a pot and keep it in the fridge for a day or two while I decide what it might be, or to send photographs to other experts to confirm the identity, and then it gets released. But some of our really small moths, you do need to take a specimen still. You might need to dissect them to work out what they are. So I will do that if I think it's something interesting and unusual. And I used to do spiders before I did moths, and those you do need to preserve in order to identify them. So I think, where there's a need to do it, then it's a perfectly acceptable thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And being the entomology curator in the room, I will attest to that. So we do still collect and preserve a large number of insects. And as Katty mentioned, that's because some of the morphology is very tricky. So for beetles, for instance, sorry, I said I wasn't going to do it, but I've done it. We've got about 4,000 species in the UK, and many of them are tiny, and we do need to dissect them because the outer characteristics may be, they may be indistinguishable from one species to another, and it's only those internal characters that will differ. So we do need to get it under a microscope and dissect. Also, there's great value in having that physical specimen, because more often than not, what we're being requested at the museum, the requests that we're getting in are to use the collection for molecular purposes. So actually extracting the DNA from specimens, and they can do that now from specimens that are over 100 years old. So there's great value in having a physical specimen. Not just that, we are all human and we do make mistakes. So whichever method you do, having a photograph or having a physical specimen is important, because you may have misidentified it. And so having that evidence there means that somebody else can come back to it, they can verify that record and support or re-identify that specimen.
So, how are moths, butterflies, or other insects identified if no one has found them or identified them before?
Oh, so we're in the realm of something very exciting. You've potentially got a new species on your hand. So I am not a taxonomist, but my colleagues, my line manager at the museum is a taxonomist, and so it is his job to double check that that is something that is new to science, and then write a description. So a description is written, a paper is published to alert the community that there is this new species. It's given a name, a description. It's usually now also had its DNA sequenced to double check. And then those specimens are what we call type specimens. They are deposited in the museum so that they can be accessed by any other researchers. They should always be put in museums. It's not very good practice to have them at home, because they should be accessible to the community. And they are our most scientifically valuable part of the collection. They will what we will rescue if there is a disaster or a fire or something. They're really, really, really important to us.
For Holly, what sort of activities do you get involved with while being a volunteer with butterfly conservation?
So there's a range of different activities that they offer, and of course once you know people you can kind of arrange stuff yourselves, but they do lots of moth trapping nights and stuff like that, so public events that you could come to, and you could either go to nighttime whilst they're setting them up, or you could come in the morning, usually quite early, whilst they're picking through the egg boxes and seeing what they have. But we also do habitat management, so it could be clearing trees or planting, or even just growing stuff at your home, but really they'll have it all on their website. But if you're able to provide flowers and get involved and just find out a bit more into it, then it's really rewarding. Especially like the scrub clearing things when you're standing next to like a really big pile of trees and you feel very victorious. But yeah, no, I think it's all very rewarding.
I've seen some of Holly's photos, so I can vouch for the fact that she really, really loves doing this.
So you just mentioned providing more flowers. So we have a question here. Is there anything that we can do to help or support moths in our local environment? And then a kind of related question, what is the biggest threat to moth species?
Really, really important questions here. Katty, over to you.
So in terms of what can you do to help moths, so flowers, a lot of moths, adult moths need nectar to give them energy to do their thing. So planting flowers in your garden, in your window box, getting your local parks or councils to encourage flowers in their verges and that sort of thing, really important. Really important to have a sort of connected resource of flowers as well, not just a big clump in one place. But then for moths, quite often people forget that they have a big part of their life as caterpillars, and that's when they do most of their eating. And so it's really important to provide food for the caterpillar stage of the life cycle as well. And really good plants for this are things like nettles and brambles and all the things that people don't like to, and grasses don't like to grow in their garden. But if you can have a little space put aside for that sort of thing, then that's really helpful. And then things for overwintering. So a lot of our species need to hide away somewhere sheltered during the winter, either as a caterpillar or a pupa or an adult. And so piles of bits of vegetation or log piles and things like that are also really useful for that stage of the life cycle.
And as you already touched on earlier, these actions that you're doing to benefit moths are also going to benefit a whole
Yes.
range of other insects as well.
Yeah.
A question for Don. What made you interested in the women, in particular in entomology, rather than the men?
Thank you for that question, and I love that question. So I actually started out with the men. And there were all these women, and I couldn't ignore them. And they just became much more interesting. I mean, really. So, we have all of these narratives about men scientists, and, everyone knows about Charles Darwin and others. But, how many women scientists, can you name? Can we name, of the past? We all know about Marie Curie, right? But then when you start thinking about others beyond Marie Curie, it gets more difficult to name those women. And there were a lot of women. So I wanted to tell that story. Like, I suppose, I see the importance of history to tell new narratives about the past. So, I should also mention that, the Balfours as a family are just so fascinating. They were a large, family, and they were all talented in different ways. Alice's sisters, Evelyn married a physicist, there's a lot that could be said about her role within a scientific household. She married Lord Rayleigh. And then the other sister, Nora Sidgwick, became principal of Newnham College at Cambridge, and she was part of that whole movement to open up higher education for women. So this was a remarkable family. And again, Alice typically, does not get the recognition, that she deserved. So, as soon as I started noticing all of what Alice did, I'm like, her story needs to be told. And then I came across Katty, who's been blogging about Alice and, has now published a book in which she's got a chapter, on Alice. So I had to reach out to Katty. So we've been talking, for a few years now.
I read your paper, Behind Folding Shutters, right at the beginning of my explorations, really. And as I said, it's really nice to bring these different disciplines into it's the study of a woman, really, but bringing her moths and her family background together.
Yeah, aren't we so glad that you went in that direction, Don? Thank you.
So I was going to ask a kind of related to that question. I was wondering if you had any data on where we're at now with women in entomology or women in science. Is it any better?
I knew someone was going to ask this question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I would hope that membership in the Royal Entomological Society is more balanced now. Maybe you know this.
I don't know the numbers, but I attend the meetings, as does Katty for some of them, and I can say that in the last 10 years when I've been attending these meetings, there definitely feels like there's more of us, there's more representation, and that's really reassuring and a positive thing to see. When I was very early in my career, I'd sometimes be one of 2 women in the room, and that was only 10 years ago. But yeah, there's been this huge change. And I mean, for me, I was inspired by some incredible female entomologists, particularly some curators at the Natural History Museum in London. And yeah, I had them as great role models. And I think what's important is that we continue to go in this direction and make sure that there is those role models still visible for the next generation. So that'll be you, Holly.
Do you think women in entomology are drawn to moths specifically? And for the entomologists on the panel, why moths?
Oh, that's got to go to one of you two. So let's go for Holly first.
Why moths? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I started off with butterflies, as most people do, just from seeing things online. But I mean, as soon as you actually start looking into it, you realize moths, they're so much more diverse. There's just so much more to be interested in, I think. And yeah, also the fact that you just don't expect it. It's a complete surprise. I think that's really sticks with you, because it's outside in your garden and you just didn't realize it was there. So it's very accessible and very, yeah.
So I would definitely agree with all of that. For me, so I've always been interested in natural history, right from a really young age. Did a lot of bird watching as a teenager. Got into aphids I had a bit of time with, and spittle bugs. And then I spent quite a lot of time doing spiders. But then when I moved up to Scotland, so that would be, I keep saying 10 years ago, but it's probably 13 or 14 years ago now, I was looking for getting volunteering. I had a very young family, looking for opportunities of volunteering, and I started volunteering with my local countryside ranger team, and there was one of those rangers who was a moth recorder. He did moth trapping at one of the reserves, so I went along, and actually moths fit in very well with young children because it happens at night, so you can still do all the mum things during the day, but you can go and have your own time at night with your moths, or late at night and early in the morning. So that fitted in really well. And then I gradually got to know the moth community in Scotland, a wonderful bunch of people. I got to know my county moth recorder, who's here, who was really supportive in getting me out and about in East Lothian and out away from my garden. So I think it could have been any insect group for me. I've always been fascinated in insects and invertebrates, but because of the people I met and the opportunities I had at a time in my life when I had the right sort of time available to me, it all kind of fell into place, and it's just snowballed from there. So I don't know what might be next. Wasps, maybe?
I can't imagine you moving away from moths, to be honest. And for me, I actually started out with flies, blowflies. So I studied forensic science at university as my undergrad, specialised in forensic entomology. So I was really into all the gory, gross stuff, dead bodies, blowflies and beetles. So I sidestepped from blowflies to carrion beetles, and that is still my passion. If you want to know more about carrion beetles, please go Google them, watch some of our videos. We'll have a separate event for them, perhaps. But they do occur in light traps, I should say, often termed as bycatch, unfortunately. But yes, if you run a light trap to attract moths, you'll sometimes get some of these beetles that I'm referring to, carrion beetles. If you've got any questions, get in touch. But yes, so I sidestepped from the forensics into the more sort of general side of entomology, and I have found moths more recently. So in my position here, I have to do a little bit of everything. We get inquiries from lots of different people about different things, and I meet lots of wonderful moth recorders and entomologists that come to visit the collection, and it's really through meeting them and seeing their passion for moths and doing a little project on our grounds at the moment at the collection centre, which is in the north of the city, where we've been enhancing our grounds to make it better for biodiversity and to support the local urban insects. And actually one of our volunteers has been very dedicated and run light traps with us there, and it's through her enthusiasm for moths that I've kind of caught that bug as well. So thank you, Dorothy.
There are a few questions in here about what are the current challenges faced by women in entomology and how do we do something about them. But somebody specifically asked, what new challenges do women in entomology face now when compared to the past?
Oh, that is a good one. Katty, do you want to take that first?
I might have to think about that. So for me personally, and I've had a kind of funny career, if you can call it career, you know, it's sort of been interspersed with various things and quite bitty. But I haven't personally sort of felt any disadvantage or barrier as a woman, other than the usual things of having children and stuff like that. So I think it's a very accessible science for all genders. There are increasingly more women involved, and where I work now as an entomologist, more women than men actually in our little group at the moment. So I can't really think of what the challenges are. I know I'm speaking for myself, and I know other people have different experiences.
So for me, the challenges are sometimes field work. I'm frequently the only woman on the field trips that I'm on, and so that can cause some issues when you need to go to the toilet or you're, you know, in a certain point in your cycle. So there's challenges still there. But I think also something that we need to improve upon is making sure that people know that entomology is something that they can get involved in from an early age. A lot of children are just naturally curious and interested in insects, but that tends to disappear as they, you know, come into their teens. Sometimes that's influence from their peers or their parents, but I certainly didn't know at a young age that it was a job that I could have. And there are some positive changes happening. You may have heard that there's going to be a natural history GCSE, so that's really positive and really, really exciting. But I think we still have a long way to go in making sure that our young people know that, you know, they can get into natural history and study insects as a career. Question down here?
Hi, I was just wondering about your experiences out in the field and your favourite kind of experience that comes to mind, and your favourite maybe historical story.
Oh, we've got a question about our favourite moments. That's quite a tricky one. There is so many. Anything jumping out at you at the moment, Katty?
Well, I've got lots of favourite moments, if you're allowed to have lots of favourite moments, and it's when there's a combination of probably a moth that perhaps I've been wanting to see for a while, or something new in a place that I've been visiting for a long time. And so it's the excitement of the species that I wanted to see, but it's also about the place, wherever that might be, and it's about the people that you're with. So it's quite a sort of, all these things come together to make a memorable moment, I think. Trying to think of what's my most recent one that got me excited. You put me on the spot, I'll come back.
I'll just jump in with, so as an historian, what really excites me is getting into archives and, you know, looking at old documents like the notebooks that Katty had mentioned. And just seeing these, you know, old manuscripts and finding, the past comes alive through those documents. And, you know, and for a lot of these characters that I've studied, their materials are not, you know, kept in libraries and archives and things like that. Later generations of the families have held on to them. So I've actually had to go visit, you know, these, you know, private archives held by the families. And what's been fun is, you know, of course, looking at the materials, but then having conversations with these older generations. So there was a great niece of Alice's who was still living when I visited their estate. And she's like, I very much remember my aunt. She was, very firm, like she ruled the household, like, very strong personality. And I remember her saying, when she was upset with one of the staff, just like, drat, like at the top of her, and to hear, this story, like it just brought that past alive in a way that you can't get from the documents. So it's that sort of like detective work that I think is fun.
And for me, I'll echo what Katty said. It very much depends, a favourite moment, the people that I'm with. I've been out in the field with some really brilliant people, a little bit like Holly said, like when you're out with these folks that have been studying these things for decades and decades, it's really exciting to be with them, where they can show you the techniques and you can, be a sponge and absorb all that knowledge and information. So I love being out with those people. But I love seeing new things, and that's the wonderful thing about entomology is that, there's so many different insects. Globally, we've got over 1 million described species. And, there's just so much to be seen. So I love ticking off new beetles, and, moths are great too. But, it's really exciting when you see something you haven't seen before. And then the challenge is to try and get a decent photo, to prove that you've seen it and to kind of capture that moment and go back and show all your entomology pals. Yeah.
And it doesn't have to, well, for me, it doesn't have to be rare or anything like that. It's, it's very much the time and the place.
I was actually on fieldwork just a couple of weeks ago, and the thing that I got most excited about on the first or second day that I was there was a gorgeous little monkey beetle. It was a pale green colour. I'd never seen one before. I should stress that this wasn't in Scotland, it was in Italy. But I went to take a photo and I dropped the beetle, just as Katty was saying Alice had done. And I was devastated because it disappeared into the vegetation, lost forever. I spent the next 2 days searching for it, didn't see it again, and then on the fourth day, they were everywhere. And it turned out that it was one of the most common beetles in the area. But it's that just exciting thing about going to a new place and just seeing something different.
I think this is a question for you, and I'm going to read this.
Okay.
Question of a lifetime and raging debate among my social circle. Can flies fart?
Oh gosh, I know there's a book called Does It Fart? And I'm pretty sure it includes flies, but I don't remember.
Does anyone here know?
I don't know.
I was a museum educator before this, and I would say, why don't you go and find out yourself?
There's a fantastic book called Does It Fart? So I'll go home and I'll check that. Get back to you.
Keep an eye on Ashleigh's Twitter for the answer. Some technical questions. What is your best recipe for sugaring a rope? Does this method offer a good sampling technique?
Wow. So it offers a different sampling technique, which is important because there's some moths that won't come to light or don't come to light very readily, but they love a sugary wine rope. So it's important that way. And actually, I quite enjoy going out and looking for moths in a way where you can see them behaving, see them doing something. So if you go sugaring and you get moths attracted to your sugar, you can watch them, sucking away at the sugar, and that's really nice. Whereas in a light trap in the morning, they tend to just be sitting in an egg tray. So it's sort of less exciting in that way. The best recipe for wine ropes is to buy the cheapest bottle of wine you can find.
That's good news.
Yeah. Get half of it and mix that with a big bag of sugar, heat it up, melt it, and then soak some rags in it. Then leave the other half of wine on the table for your husband to drink while you go out and spend the night looking for moths. Worked, isn't it?
Brilliant.
I recently heard that street lighting poses a big risk to moths. How serious an issue is this, and would you urge councils to change how they do street lighting?
Katty.
Okay, yes. So street lighting, outdoor lighting, artificial light at night, ALAN is what it gets termed at, is a problem for all sorts of wildlife, not just moths. All sorts of wildlife are affected by bright light shining at night for navigation, for doing their normal behaviour. And the thing with a lot of the lights at night is that we don't need them. So there are circumstances where we do want to have lit ways, but awful lot of things we don't need to have lit up all night. So it's a really easy thing that we could fix and improve massively by doing just a very small flick of a switch, really. So it really, should be done. And there's all sorts of, you can have lights that only point downwards so that they aren't as damaging to the wildlife, and you can have different wavelengths of light which we can still see by, but which don't influence the wildlife as much. You can have timers so that they just come on when somebody's walking through. This is all sorts of, we've got the technology, why don't we use it? It's such a simple fix. There's many things, other things that we need to fix, bigger things, but lighting is something that we could make a big difference to, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyone else?
I think the how we get the local councils to change their mind about things, though, that's the trickier question.
So how has climate change affected moth populations?
Katty, that's another one for you.
We could open it out of it. So that's a sort of complex one as well. So we've got warming temperatures, which can influence our moths in different ways. So there's species that need a warmer climate that are able to move northwards as the northerly climates get warmer. They might be able to reproduce and fit their sort of life cycle in more quickly, so you get more generations happening in a year. The unpredictability of our weather systems that climate change is introducing is perhaps one of the most worrying things, is that our wildlife times its life cycle according to sort of reliable patterns of cold winters and then mild springs and hot summers or whatever it might be. But now we're getting a lot of unpredictability. So we're getting snow in May, and we're getting periods of drought followed by periods of flood. And that makes it really hard for insects, all insects, to time their life cycles and to survive that. And then if it keeps happening, each time the numbers get smaller and smaller, and then they get less resilient to be able to cope. So lots of bad things going on really with climate. And we get excited in Scotland because we're getting new species of moth moving in, and everyone's like, oh, it's new for Scotland, or I've never seen that before. But maybe we should be a little bit concerned about some of these rapid movements northwards, because it's not right, it shouldn't be happening as quickly as it is.
Absolutely. We've got a question in the room.
Is it on? Yes, I just wanted to ask you, I had a farm and used to roam around at night time, and I came across this caterpillar with a big black, looked like a sting on the end of its tail. When I touched it, it did swish over just like a scorpion does. And I wondered, do we have any moths that can sting?
No.
So
It's a definitive no.
So that would have been a hawk moth, probably, caterpillar.
Right.
A lot of them which have that hooky thing on the back. I think it's a camouflage thing partly, so it looks like a spine of a branch. And they will rear up if they're feeling threatened, different caterpillar species or moths, or many insects back, and it's a defense mechanism. They're trying to scare whatever predator might be harming them. So that's why it will have done its scorpion thing, probably.
Well, I had spent a lot of time with scorpions, so I was fighting them.
Yeah, but no, it wouldn't hurt you.
Like, great behaviour to witness. Can we get a microphone over here?
While I run up.
You said that you were seeing different moths than Alice. Is this because of global warming, do you reckon?
So I'll just repeat that one. So
Back to the previous.
you said you've been seeing different moths compared to what Alice saw. Is that because of global warming?
So mostly the new moths that I've seen that Alice didn't see are ones that have been moving northwards, and that is largely because of the warming climate, meaning that they used to being down in the south of England, they can now survive our winters up here. But there are also some species that I have found which were around in Alice's day, but she never saw, and that's probably because of my equipment is slightly different. So the light traps I use now to attract moths have a much brighter light than Alice did, and they're portable, so I can take them into the middle of a woodland and catch moths that way. So there's some species that she just would have found much harder to come by using her methods. Yeah.
If you could go back and meet one of these women, then who would it be? Where would you ask them to take you, and why?
Oh, that's such a cool question. Come on, Don, you first.
So definitely Alice, because I've read accounts from her nieces about going mothing with Auntie, and the way it's described, it just sounded like so much fun. They would they would take the car out with the chauffeur and use the lights on the car. So yeah, definitely Alice. There's just something about her that I find so fascinating. Yeah.
That's really cool. And I imagine, Katty, that it would also be Alice for you?
Well, yeah, I don't want to give the same answer as Don. You have to come mothing with me and compare and contrast.
That's true. That's true.
So, I mean, there's a whole lot going much further back to a woman called Marion.
I was going to say that.
Oh, sorry. Who I'm going to struggle, and I have to look in my book to find out the facts about her. But she was a brilliant artist. She drew all life cycles of, all life stages of the moth, and was sort of one of the first to. It was back in the 16.
Yeah, it was early.
Where they, were still trying to discover how a caterpillar became a moth or a butterfly, and that whole metamorphosis life cycle. And she, by just observing them in her kitchen or wherever she had her jars of specimens, painting each of the different stages and working out what happened, and the fact that that type of egg and that type of caterpillar always became that kind of adult. And she had wasps that hatched out, the parasitic wasps that hatched out of some of her specimens. So, well ahead of her time, as it turns out. And so I think she would have been really interesting to get to know.
Yeah, I was actually going to say I was going to, matchmake you and Maria Marion,
yes,
who
absolutely.
Katty's just said, because that would be great to see you and Maria like hanging out, going through the jungle, collecting these caterpillars.
Sounds amazing.
She was really into rearing things as well, like just how you do now. So
Fabulous,
yeah, that would have been cool. And for me, I think it's already obvious. Dorothy Jean Jackson, awesome Scottish coleopterist. Yeah, would love to have hung out with her. I don't horse ride though, so we'd have had to find a different mode of transportation.
Yeah, so when she first went, I don't think we discussed this, but when she first went out, Dorothy Jackson, looking for moths up in the Highlands, apparently she went out on horseback with her friend looking for moths that way. So not quite a Rolls Royce, but that Alice used.
More environmentally friendly.
Holly, there was a picture that you had up there of someone looked like they were having a very good time with a net. Can you tell us what was going on?
Should we go back?
Yeah, I think we can.
This one.
So
Who's that gentleman?
Me and Tom Prescott. He is our, I think, head officer now for Scotland for butterfly conservation. We were out looking for. It was some caterpillar. It was possibly broadboard. No, it was yellow underwing of some kind. But yeah, no. So we were just out searching, and Tom likes to have a bit of fun. So we were posing for photos by the dramatic waterfall in the back. We thankfully did actually find the caterpillars. We found about a dozen, which he ended up, all the non-rare ones ended up being my pets, and he kept all the rare ones. But yeah, we found about 2 out there, so it was really fun. Most events do tend to be like that, and with cake as well.
Yeah, I think it really well captures the enthusiasm and the fun that entomologists have in the field together.
Yeah, definitely.
So what is the advice for people who want to get involved with moth conservation?
I'm going to put that to Katty first, but I know that Holly's going to have some tips as well.
So get involved, I suppose, is the best thing you can do. All sorts of events go on around the country. You can look at Butterfly Conservation's website for their events, but there are other events as well. You can go along to light trap mornings or evenings. You can go on daytime surveys for particular species. You can come and volunteer at a museum and get to know moths that way. There's all sorts of different sort of routes in, and it doesn't just have to be about butterflies or moths either. There's all sorts of other insects that are available, and they're all fascinating, and they can all... so my advice would be to try lots of different things as well and find the thing that really makes you buzz.
Holly, did you want to add anything more to that?
Well, yeah, I think they're expanding their range of what they're kind of offering. Like, they do lots of like sort of arty, different like projects with communities and stuff and like primary schools. So really, whatever you're interested in, there will probably be an event for it. And once you kind of get to know the people are really what make it. So you can start doing your own trapping events with them, or get your own trap, lend it from someone. And yeah, no, I think it's the people that you need to know, and then
Yeah. I'd add your local Natural History Society as well. If you're in Edinburgh, we have Edinburgh Natural History Society. Go check out their website. Desperate for some fresh blood. And we also have Edinburgh Entomological Club. Very keen to get some new members to that. These are wonderful groups with people that have been studying natural history for decades and always are excited to pass on that knowledge and that enthusiasm. So basically, it's all about people. That's the route into the insects.
Katty, where was the hummingbird hawk moth found in Scotland?
Well, did I have a picture of a hummingbird hawk moth?
You
I did. I can't remember where that particular photograph was taken, but they're found. I'm not going to be able to remember by looking at it either. That's on lavender, isn't it? So they're found in lots of places, particularly on the East Coast. They come in as migrants. You'll get them along the Berwickshire coast, the East Lothian coast, further inland. If you've got lavender or what's that red flower? Red valerian, thank you. They love that, so they'll come to that. And they do just look like little hummingbirds, this sort of thing buzzing around, so keep rising. I mean, I don't know if anyone in the audience here have got top tips for how to find hummingbird hawk moths?
In my garden.
In your garden? Go to that lady's garden.
I think one of Ballygonish State Forest.
Okay.
Would you like to repeat that one?
Bonnie Rig. Yeah? So, yeah. Any more?
Well, if you'd like to host an entomological visit to your garden, I'm sure there'd be a few of us very keen to come.
Is that on
Yeah,
any
they're very
particular flower? So that's on valerian? Yeah, so lots of people swear by red valerian.
There are a few, a bit more questions, but I think, so if you haven't had a chance to ask your question, or I haven't been able to, please, they are very friendly and approachable. But we'll finish with a few more. So what is your favourite moth? Somebody said, what is your favourite moth, butterfly species? And then, as you said, Katty, other insects are available. What are your favourite insects?
Holly, you first.
I think for moths, it's not exactly the most out there, but the poplar hawk moth. So they have like their hind wings pushed forward. They have quite an abnormal shape. But actually, we saw goat moth when we were at Glenstrath Forest. So yeah, we were doing like.
Excited.
Was it actually smelly?
It was, yes.
Or is
but
it
the tree was.
the caterpillars?
Yeah.
Katty, was that a favourite
So
for you?
I'd forgotten about the goat moth experience. So I'd never seen a goat moth before, and we were on a moth survey up in the Highlands. And a goat moth came to someone else's trap, actually. It wasn't even my trap, which is slightly annoying. This big moth. So goat moth spends most of its life as a caterpillar inside a tree, eating the inside of a tree, birch trees, or lots of species of trees. And then if you time it right, you can get to see these big moths. So we knew there was a goat moth tree because you can see the big holes in it that the caterpillars make. but to actually see one was pretty exciting. I've got a particular fondness for moths that overwinter as adults in caves and mines and culverts and things like that, which I spend a lot of my winter time doing. So tissue moth, a tissue moth, is one of my favourite species, I think. It's quite unusual in Scotland. It gets more common as you go further south, but even though I know the places where I can see one each year, I still get really excited every year that I see one.
And it's not a particularly, don't be mad at me for saying this, but it's not a particularly brightly coloured, like,
but it is
jazzy
beautiful.
Specimen, but it's very beautiful, yeah.
Silvery with rose pink hues, and it's just beautiful. Yeah. And again, it goes to the sort of the place and the places that it's taken me in my search for them.
So Don, you might not have a favourite moth already, but something very exciting is going to be happening for you in the next couple of days, hopefully. So Don will be joining Katty to do some light trapping. And you can join too, I should say, because we have a couple of moth trapping events as part of the Insect Week celebrations, where Katty will be running light traps over at the National Museum of Flight in East Lothian, not far from where Katty and Alice both have lived. So you can join for an early morning session, either tomorrow or Monday morning. Full details available on the website, but Don is hoping to join for one of those sessions. So maybe by tomorrow lunchtime or Monday lunchtime, you might have a favourite moth.
It's also exciting because Don's staying for a couple of nights on Whittingham Estate, not in Alice's old house, but near there. So I'm wondering whether I might be able to sneak a light trap into his rented accommodation.
This is the passion and enthusiasm we're talking about. Brilliant. Obviously, my favourite insect is not a moth. I'm a real big fan of hawk moths, though, putting them on my face. That's great fun. My favourite insect is a group of beetles. I can't pick my favourite because that's asking, I imagine, like if you have children, it's like asking you to pick a favourite child. So it's carrion beetles, or maybe specifically burying beetles, and that's just because they have really, really cool behaviour. The male and female work together to bury a dead mouse or dead bird. They do all sorts of grim stuff, stripping the fur or feathers off the corpse, spreading their anal secretions around to preserve the flesh, feeding on the flesh, regurgitating to the offspring. It's just like bird chicks in a nest, and it's really remarkable that there are beetles that are doing this. So yeah, absolutely my favourite group of insects. Anyone else want to ask a final question in the room before we sadly wrap up, because we are coming to the end? One at the front.
I just have a question. So I'm a photographer. I know a fair few people that do macro photography, especially relating to insects. So I'm just wondering, when you're, so I see they're not necessarily doing it to identify, or they're probably not coordinating with any scientists or entomologists. And I'm just wondering, is there some way that you guys could be coordinating with the photographic community to be getting some of these images that you could be using for identifying or cataloging or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about macro photographers, and do we collaborate with them? Are they, because they're usually just taking photographs for artistic purposes, for enjoyment, but we could obviously harvest information and records from those. It is happening to some extent. I am what we call a verifier on one of the recording platforms called iRecord, and some of the quality of the images that come through there are incredible, and they are taken by macro photographers. So there are some that are already doing this, which is great. There are other platforms such as iNaturalist, where again a lot of the macro photographers are sharing their sightings there, so even though they might not themselves be able to identify things, it's one of those platforms that uses a community to help put identifications to things. So it's happening, but we could do a bit more. Certainly there's scope for getting macro photographers involved with Insect Week. We have a photography exhibition through the Royal Entomological Society, so there's a little bit of overlap there. And I know a couple of local macro photographers who have come to Edinburgh Entomological Club and given talks, and so we're doing what we can to network, but I think we can do even more, you're right. Anything to add there, folks? No, in that case, I think we're going to have to wrap up because we just have a couple of minutes left, and we have a couple more things that we want to leave you with. Let me just flick through these. Okay, so we just, again, want to give a very, very big thank you to our panellists who have been so wonderful today. They've answered so many questions for us and really done a wonderful thing of giving us this overview, this insight into women in entomology, past, present, and future. It certainly filled me with a lot of hope, and I kind of want to just get outside and go look for insects. So join me in giving a big round of applause to our panellists today. Of course, our event today has been part of Insect Week, organised by the Royal Entomological Society, but it's also been supported by two other organisations, both Butterfly Conservation, that we've mentioned many times today, but another more silent organisation that we've not mentioned yet, which is the British Society for the History of Science. So big thank you to them for enabling us to put this event on today for you. We just want to mention as well that there are many ways beyond Insect Week that you can get involved. Obviously, we've discussed some of those already, but something to keep an eye on is the Big Butterfly Count, which will be happening from the 12th of July through to the 4th of August. Go check out the website, download the app, and get involved in that. It's a great way to help record moths and butterflies. And then I'll pass over to Ashleigh to do some closing remarks for you.
Well, thank you, Ashleigh. And thank you all for joining us. You will be sent a feedback form following this event to your email, and your feedback helps us to form our future events and to continue to hold events like this today. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm going to try and find the butterfly specimens that were in the Grand Gallery and bring them back very quickly. So thank you, Ashleigh. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming.